BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. In this episode, I will be responding to the psychological profile created by Pat Brown. She's a criminal profiler and also the author of the books Killing for Sport and The Profiler, and I've referenced Pat Brown's material on this channel in the past, talking about several different cases, which I will bring up throughout the duration of this recording. But if I can be very honest with you guys, I think that this is the worst attempt that she has ever done. I'm getting this material from her YouTube channel, Profiling with Pat Brown, and she created about a 2.5-hour live stream, and once again, I think it's the worst episode of her show that I have ever seen, if I can be frank. And I should also point out that there is a direct response to her psychological profile on the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, which is run by Ryan Burns, and I did not have the opportunity to watch that one yet, but Ryan always makes great content, just sharing some other resources on the subject. So let's talk about some of these strengths that were shared in Pat Brown's psychological profile, and that is that she estimates that D.B. Cooper was somebody who was in his early 40s. She says around 40. He was someone who perhaps did not have a criminal past, which, I think is a relatively safe observation, someone who would not have been previously arrested. She believes that D.B. Cooper was a skyjacker who had intimate knowledge of airplanes. I also think that that's a very strong point. She seems to think that not only did he know a lot about airplanes and aviation, but specifically about the Boeing 727, because D.B. Cooper gets on the plane using the name Dan Cooper, and then she starts talking about how, he opens the briefcase and displays what appears to have been a bomb, takes the plane hostage, demands the $200,000 and 4 parachutes, and he obtains this stuff successfully in Seattle. Then, at some point, during the takeoff, going from Seattle back to Reno, down to Reno, I should say, D.B. Cooper jumps out, parachutes into the night, never to be seen or heard from again. Okay, so some of the things that happened on the plane. Number one, another safe point, she says that the bomb was a dud. She doesn't even believe that D.B. Cooper would have had the knowledge to create a real functioning bomb using red sticks of dynamite, and there's some reasons for that we'll say throughout this episode. The second one is that she believes that D.B. Cooper asked for 4 parachutes because he wanted to create the illusion that he was going to take a hostage, and also there was the practical benefit that he could inspect the parachutes if he knew something about them, and then he could choose which one was the most suitable. But most importantly, there are multiple people on the plane. There is Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who stays with him, and then there are also the crew in the cockpit. So D.B. Cooper wants to create the illusion that he could have the possibility of taking hostages. And I do emphasize that, the possibility, meaning that if he only asked for the 2 parachutes, the front and the reserve, that would make it pretty obvious that he was going to jump by himself, or jump in a way that would be extremely catastrophic, like if he pushed Tina out of the back of the plane down the aft staircase. That would be something that would be extremely homicidal. And Pat Brown was also saying that D.B. Cooper is referred to as somebody who is not being mean, he's not being rough, he is cool, calm, and collected, and he is somebody who doesn't seem to want to hurt people. And I have a twofold response to that, but those are all very, very safe and simple observations. Now, I want to get into some of the things that I want to challenge, and that is that, number one, she does not believe that D.B. Cooper had a military background. I'm really quite surprised to hear this, because one of the biggest observations that has been made by people in the world of criminal profiling is they think that D.B. Cooper was ex-military. And you guys know that I talk a lot about the book The Skyjacker by Dr. David G. Hubbard, who really wanted to write a psychological profiling book specifically relevant to skyjackers. And his observations in terms of relevance to D.B. Cooper are that not only was D.B. Cooper ex-military, he was ex-Vietnam, a Vietnam veteran, and that he was a pilot, a former pilot. And Ryan Burns talks about this a lot when he says that there are other skyjackers out there, and these copycats all had military backgrounds in aviation. And D.B. Cooper does seem to know an enormous amount about aviation, and he's saying that, things on the plane, like he wants the landing gear down when the plane is flying, depressurized cabin, the flaps have to be at a certain angle, going 200 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. He also knew where the oxygen tanks were on the Boeing 727. And Pat Brown did not believe that D.B. Cooper had a military background. Instead, she seemed to be just building up to this for the first hour of her program, that D.B. Cooper was an ex-Boeing employee, or perhaps somebody who had connections to Boeing. She believes that he obtained this intimate knowledge of the Boeing 727 from working with the company Boeing specifically. And, everyone can make their own interpretation of the evidence, but I really thought it was weird that she would leave that out. And it's the reason for it. Because she starts out her program by saying, okay, D.B. Cooper is on the plane, but what did he not do? What is missing? What did D.B. Cooper not have? And I'm like, well, come on, you got to give us something more than that. Where are you going with this? And it's gloves, she said. He touched multiple things on the plane. He's touching the armrest, and also he's handling the glass that he's using to drink bourbon and soda from. D.B. Cooper also smoked multiple cigarettes. He left behind his clip-on tie on the plane. What is she trying to do? She's trying to say that he was not worried about leaving fingerprints behind. And she says that, number one, that should indicate that he did not have a criminal past. Number two, that should indicate that he did not have a military background, because people would get fingerprinted when they went into the military. And I'll even add an additional point. One thing that I've encountered with my explorations into the Zodiac Killer mystery is that people would also be fingerprinted if they had certain government level jobs. A government employee can be fingerprinted too. And even on a personal note, I did an application for the Peace Corps when I was 22. I didn't go to the Peace Corps. It was just a possibility that I was exploring after the university days, and I was fingerprinted for my Peace Corps application. So countless things are going to have and require you to be fingerprinted. But she believes that Cooper is touching all of these things because he is not worried about being fingerprinted, because he wasn't in the military, he wasn't in the prison system, he perhaps wasn't a government employee, he perhaps didn't do a Peace Corps application if they required that back in the earlier years. So she just thinks that his fingerprints weren't on file, and he didn't have to worry about anything. And that's an extremely bold statement. I mean, that is just something where I can understand the train of thought, and I can understand the process that she is using to generate this type of profiling observation, but I'm not convinced of that at all. What could be the alternatives? And her audience was even calling her out on this by saying, number one, Cooper was suicidal. And yes, let's differentiate between suicidal tendencies, all I wanted was a Pepsi, sorry, and suicidal contemplation. It's suicidal tendencies versus suicidal contemplation, meaning that, I just have to just sort of say it this way, that Cooper might not have been directly intending to commit suicide, but he was someone who wasn't afraid of taking his own life, and then that's why he's just handling everything. Maybe he's going to die, maybe he won't. Drew Beeson talks about this all the time with his suspect, Ted B. Braden, when he says that he had a death wish partnered with the iron will to live. Somebody like that might not be too worried about leaving fingerprints behind. And also, maybe Cooper thought that they wouldn't be able to use the fingerprints. That could be another one. He might have thought that, well, they're probably not going to be able to get fingerprints off of the cigarettes, or maybe he just didn't care. And, that could be one way to explain everything. Cooper did not care if he left evidence behind. Maybe Cooper had a solid getaway plan, but to say that he was never in the military, that he was never fingerprinted and had his stuff put into the system, I'm going to offer an alternative, and this is not a devil's advocate alternative. This is something that I genuinely think, and that is that she could be overlooking a critical variable. I mean, they weren't using electronic databases back in 1971 to have his prints on file. Maybe, some way, somehow, the records existed, but they just did not connect and coincide, and they just did not line up. To say that Cooper was never arrested or never in the military, I think is a premature statement on her part. But it also seemed like she's leaning toward a suspect such as Milton Vordahl, who definitely did his share of government work. Milton Vordahl worked on the bomb that was dropped over Japan in World War II, and he actually solved an equation that allowed for that to happen. But Milton Vordahl is somebody who was a scientist, working with Boeing and also with titanium, and he would have an explanation for the rare elements that were on his time. And also, an interesting thing that was brought up by Pat Brown, to give some credit to her, is that she's saying that perhaps D.B. Cooper had some familiarity with the parachutes, but he didn't demonstrate anything that would show that he knew parachutes intimately or that he had ever jumped as a skydiver before. And Milton Vordahl was somebody who did not have a strong skydiving background to the best of our knowledge. If he had anything that involved paratrooping or jumping, or I shouldn't say paratrooping, parachuting, jumping, skydiving, that does not seem to be found in a lot of the profiles that have been created for Milton Vordahl, but just throwing that out there. And another suspect that would have the type of explanation for the scientific background, as well as the rare elements on D.B. Cooper's tie, would be Vince Peterson. I have standalone episodes about both of them here on Black Box Online Radio, and all of the suspect profile episodes have been made into a playlist. I invite you guys to check it out. But more importantly, let's talk about some other things that Pat Brown shared in her psychological profile of D.B. Cooper, and I want to talk about the money find at Tina Bar. In 1980, $6,000 was found at Tina Bar in Washington State, which is a sandbar off of the Columbia River. She is first referring to it as Tena Bar, but everybody calls it Tina Bar, no matter which way it's spelled. And yes, it can be spelled T-E-N-A, T-I-N-A. You will find that in multiple places. She even brought up a sign that said Tina Bar, T-I-N-A. But $6,000 is found there that was buried in the sand. And she was frequently saying $5,000 in the live stream, but it's also referred to as $5,800, but that's like the popular urban myth. It's actually $6,000 that was found, and it had rubber bands around the money. And one of the theories that she put forward, and again, this is one thing that's truly bothering me and why I said it might possibly be the worst episode of her show that I've ever seen, is she concocted this type of hypothesis that perhaps when D.B. Cooper is walking down the stairs, the aft staircase, and he's about to jump, that the $6,000 fell out of his bag, and then maybe it bounced off the aft staircase, and then it fell out into the sky before Cooper jumped. So that's why it ends up in this rare location. Now, I think for that to work, you would need two things. Firstly, all $6,000 would have to be secure together because, as people pointed out, $6,000 in three different bundles is not going to land in the same place. When three bundles of bills are falling out of the sky, it's inconceivable for it to land in the same location. The second point is, when this money was found in 1980, the rubber bands were still intact. And you guys talk about this all the time in the comment section. If you take a rubber band and you leave it in your kitchen drawer for 2 years, it might start to fall apart. And we're talking about something that would have been buried in the sand for 9 years, and the rubber bands are still intact. And the reason why she's saying this is she did not believe that anybody would have planted the money at Tina Bar. She openly said it on her show. That's stupid for somebody to plant the money at Tina Bar, for someone to manually place the money in the sand at Tina Bar and bury it. And she had a reversal about this during her live stream as well, but I was just thinking about, now wait a second, why is that stupid? Why would you dismiss that possibility that it was manually placed there when It's not in line with Cooper's expected drop zone. It's also not consistent with the 1974 dredge, which would have destroyed the money and the rubber bands to a certain extent. And also, this whole concept of somebody planting the money in the ground, well, it might not have been financially beneficial, but I bring this up all the time on Cooper Friday, that it could have been planted by Cooper himself as a ceremonial statement. It was something that isn't really of any benefit to other people, but he would have just done it for his own emotions. And I'll share a new observation in a second, but in case you haven't heard my previous Cooper Fridays, I'll just clue you guys in. When I first learned about D.B. Cooper, years ago, well before Cooper Friday was a segment here on Black Box Online Radio, I thought the money arrived there by natural means. Not a dredge or anything, by natural means. Just there's a simple explanation that could have been provided that people just haven't thought of yet. And I've had Jude Morrow on the program. He's the author of the book Dan Cooper, and he also talked about maybe something like a flood could have moved the money. It lands in one place. Yeah, he lost the money at a certain point, and a flood moves it to that place, something like that. I'm not saying that's my go-to theory right now, but I was like, there must be some explanation as to how it got there, just people haven't thought of it yet. But the more time that I looked into the Cooper case, I tended to agree with all the people who said that it was manually planted there by someone, by human hands, like somebody buried that money at Tina Bar, because when the money is found, you have these three bundles of bills totaling around $6,000, and one of them is tilted to the side. Like if you had a three-layer cake, it would almost be like one of the layers is tilted on an angle, so it's not perfectly lined up and uneven. And for Pat Brown to just get up there and say that it's stupid for somebody to plant it there, well, it's not like they're going to be using the money or they want anybody to have the money. It could have been done for an emotional reason. I've already used the word ceremonial before. So, like, Cooper would have done this for his own personal reason. And I told you guys I thought of something originally, and that was that, what if Cooper survived the jump? I'm just watching her show, and that just hits me like a light bulb moment or a lightning bolt, so to speak. What if Cooper survived the jump, and he has the money? He has the $200,000. He gets away with all of it. And he does something with it for 9 years, slowly spending it out of the country, slowly using it, and then it doesn't bring any joy to his life. It doesn't make his life better. His life gets worse after the skyjacking. And in 1980, he still has $6,000. That is the last of the D.B. Cooper money, and he buries it at Tina Bar himself because he's just frustrated. He was like, that was the biggest thing that I've ever done, the D.B. Cooper jump. I never got caught. My life still sucks. Whatever. I don't even want this money. And Cooper goes back to his life, or maybe he did something to end it. I don't know, but just that was done as an act of frustration as opposed to a ceremonial gesture in honor of Tina Mucklow, or some people even think that that's actually the drop zone, that Cooper landed at Tina Bar and that the flight path was all off. Not of those things, but he just buried it because it didn't make his life any better. And he's like, I don't even want this money more. It's caused me more trouble than my life would have had if I hadn't made the jump at all. Okay, that's just something that came to mind for me. And I'm not presenting that as a psychological profiling statement. I'm not presenting that as something where I'm acting like I know perfectly what happened. That's literally just something that came to mind as I was watching the show. And Pat Brown talked about this very specifically in her live stream when she said about how somebody wrote into the show during her live chat, and he's like, well, $5,000 or $6,000 would have been worth a lot more in 1971 than it would be in 2025. For example, if somebody were to plant the money there, that's some valuable money. I mean, he estimated that it would have been worth $125,000, but Pat Brown actually did some math and was talking about $200,000 would be $1.5 million in today's currency, so she estimated that it wouldn't be worth $125,000, maybe closer to $50,000 in today's currency. But there's a lot that you could do with that $5,000, $6,000 that was found at Tina Bar. And then she began to have a type of reversal on the stream when she's saying, okay, well, that's a good point. I mean, maybe he put it away for a rainy day or something like that. And I was just thinking, no, no, absolutely not. I've talked about how the money could be specifically buried there, but I do not think that that money was placed there at Tina Bar for any reason to be spent later on, for any way that it would be used later in the future. If somebody were going to place that money down there as a secret hiding spot, firstly, by the riverbank, is not a good hiding spot based on how rivers function. I mean, anybody would know that. Partner with things like flooding and water levels, it could be submerged and lost. But more importantly, they would have gone to better lengths to preserve the dollar bills, to preserve the 20s. They would have done something like, I don't know, burying it in a box. And you wouldn't even have to bury it at Tina Bar for a rainy day. We have D.B. Cooper suspects who talk about safety deposit boxes that they have. And that's something that is true. You can take your contents to a safety deposit box and place it there. And we're not talking about the entirety of the $200,000. We're talking about 3 bundles of bills totaling $6,000. Somebody can go to a bank, wrap it in a paper bag, and place it in their safety deposit box. Something like that. So I do not think the money was placed there at Tina Bar for future spending, or it's a secret stash, or it's something that was meant to be used later on. Absolutely not, because it wasn't preserved. There are better alternatives and better locations for somebody to use. But I wouldn't call anybody stupid for proposing that. It's just a different interpretation of the evidence. Now, if we're going to look at some other claims that are made by Pat Brown and her psychological profile, again, live stream that's available on her channel, Profiling with Pat Brown, then I also want to talk about something that she really zoned in on. D.B. Cooper was reported to have had a type of olive skin complexion, and she began to think, well, maybe he was a Latino, or maybe he was an American Indian, or a Canadian Indian, as she called it. Although, as I understand, they are called First Nations in Canada, and she really, really wanted to use that as a type of guiding factor. At one point, she's saying that, okay, this is some guy that worked with Boeing, but she's also saying that he was someone who could have easily been Canadian. Yes, you can be both. I completely understand, but this is the profile that she's creating. Somebody who's around 40 years old, Boeing employee, and she was leaning toward the First Nation, someone who was of Canadian origin and had Canadian heritage, First Nation heritage, and that's what's causing this type of olive skin complexion. Because she was like, what if Cooper wanted to jump over southern Washington, and he jumped rather quickly because he's telling the flight attendants that he wants to go to Mexico, and they're saying, we don't have enough fuel in the plane to fly to Mexico. Well, where can we go? They agree upon Reno, Nevada. But Cooper doesn't wait very long. He jumps most likely over southern Washington. And she was even talking about some possible areas of the drop zone near Ariel, Washington, Vancouver, Washington, north of Portland, Oregon, bringing up the map even. Okay, so why those places? What she said is that it's relatively close to the Canadian border, comparatively speaking, compared to Reno, for example, and Cooper could have jumped and then crossed the Canadian border if he were indeed a Canadian citizen, and he could have spent the money in Canada, or he could have exchanged in Canada. He could have gone to a different country and exchanged it. She was saying like a country like Russia would be, you could exchange the money there and it might never get back into American circulation. And this is a theory that I've talked about a lot here on Cooper Friday. One guy was even saying that his theory was that Cooper survived the jump, he took the money and he mailed it to a location outside of the United States and then exchanged it for the local currency, and that's how it was undetected, because again, they're not using electronic databases. They aren't going to be manually searching for every single $20 bill that comes into a bank. So I mean, I completely understand the narrative once again, but in terms of a psychological profile, that doesn't seem like a psychological profile to me. That just seems like somebody going off of intuition. Oh yeah, well, this is maybe what happened. These are a few points that we know about D.B. Cooper, and by her own admission, she primarily watched one documentary, the one that was available on HBO, and featured a lot of comments from Joe Weber. And then she's just saying these things, but it doesn't seem like it's coming from a strong strong blend of the facts. It's coming just from the first thing that hits her in the mind. And I really want to differentiate with you guys. When I have a light bulb moment where something just hits me like a lightning bolt, that's what I want it to be clear. It's not like I am telling you that this is the perfect theory or the perfect Cooper profile. I was watching TV and this is something that somebody said and I had an idea for something. That is so different than saying that this is what I want to put in my serious psychological profile about DB Cooper, and she wasn't necessarily doing that on her show. She's saying that, okay, Cooper is some guy who's perhaps in his 40s, no criminal background, no military background, maybe a First Nation from Canada, maybe somebody who would jump over Washington State, then he's going to cross the border back into Canada, and somebody who was Canadian would be very familiar or had a high chance of being familiar with the French language, and then that would explain how he could have known about the Dan Cooper comics, which were published in French at the time, and the translations were not available. Dan Cooper was a Belgian comic figure that might have provided the namesake of Dan Cooper, who boarded the plane, and the media started calling him DB Cooper, the DB Cooper that we know. But, I mean, part of me wants to be like, that might be a reasonable possibility, but it's just a possibility all the same. But I'm glad she brought something up. When she read off an FBI profile when they said that they thought that D.B. Cooper was fluent in French because of this Dan Cooper connection, and she's like, whoa, no, wait a second. Just because he had exposure to the Dan Cooper comics, that doesn't mean he was fluent in French, and I'm giving her credit for this. I know I've said some critical things about her, but this is a good point. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I did high school French. I did French at college. I mean, I could probably read the Dan Cooper comics in French. Am I fluent? No, absolutely not. But someone can also have a high understanding of a language, and perhaps they can read and they can compose sentences. Maybe they'd be able to order food in a restaurant. It doesn't mean that they are fluent in a near native level. But a Canadian has a higher chance of being fluent or conversational in French, in my opinion, fluent or literate in French even, in my opinion, than just some random person from Seattle or Oregon. Now, let's talk about that for a second, because she's reading off this FBI profile that says D.B. Cooper was most likely somebody from the Washington or Oregon area. He would have been around 44 years old. This is the FBI profile, mind you. And he would have been somebody who, as they said, was fluent in French. Maybe he learned it in Europe while he was stationed abroad with the military. Definitely the FBI profile stated that this is somebody who was ex-military. Okay, though, I want to challenge all of that because, as you guys know, I do frequently talk to you about the book The Skyjacker. I've already mentioned Dr. David G. Hubbard once in this episode, and he talked about this in the chapter that I read most recently. At the end of last week's Cooper Friday, I brought up this very point. Because again, there's a difference between just general criminal profiling, which is what Pat Brown does, and focusing specifically on the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And an interesting observation that was made by Dr. David G. Hubbard when he's conducting his own research is a common trait among skyjackers is they would walk very rigorously, rigorous walking, and the second one was they didn't mind traveling long distances. They liked to travel long distances. So, this whole thing about Cooper must have lived in Oregon. Cooper must have lived in Washington State. Not necessarily. He could have been somebody who set this whole thing up because he didn't care about crossing the country just to launch the skyjacking. If he thought that he was going to get a $200,000 payday, he could have gone across the continent, even if we're going to include Canada. So this is what I genuinely think. I'm not convinced at all that Cooper lived in Washington State or Oregon. I mean, that just goes into the category of possibility A versus possibility B, and I definitely don't think that we have enough information to say that Cooper was a resident of either state. And if you want to challenge me on that, put your idea in the comment section down below. I would really like to read that. Now, some of you might be wondering, why am I sounding a little bit negative when I'm talking about Pat Brown? I'm giving her some compliments, and I'm also, being a little bit harsh in some areas. And the reason for this is I've watched her other stuff, She did a live stream about the Zodiac Killer, which I really thought wasn't so bad. The parts that I was the most critical of were not things that she said, but things that she chose to leave out when she looks at the Zodiac Killer suspects and says, "Oh yeah, there's this guy, Richard Gaikowski. I didn't see anything about him that made me think he was the Zodiac." And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Why don't you provide some reasons why you don't think this person was the Zodiac? Just saying, I didn't see anything and move on when you're talking about a suspect. I didn't necessarily care for that, but I also told you guys that she's the author of the book Killing for Sport, and I thought her serial killer observations in that book were much more relevant to the Zodiac case than anything she discussed in the live stream. Like, she left out her best observations about serial killers and how they could relate to the Zodiac killer. So it's not a perfect live stream, but overall it really wasn't too bad. And she did a live stream on Jack the Ripper, which I openly said here on Black Box Online Radio 2 weeks ago that I felt that she contaminated my thinking. She has a Jack the Ripper suspect named Jacob Levy, whom I actually think is a defendable suspect. It's more about how she contaminated my thinking by presenting this narrative that Jack the Ripper didn't talk to any of his victims, that he would just approach the women and stab them and strangle them without any previous conversations. And I still use her terminology, the bop and drop killer, that's what she calls it. And I guess I got pulled into that type of thought process because everybody's always saying these things about Jack the Ripper had to have had conversations with the women before he murdered them. And I'm like, well, now wait a second. How do we truly know that? Well, Pat Brown has provided an explanation. And also, one Jack the Ripper suspect that I think very highly of is named Aaron Kosminski. And he is one that has been challenged by a lot of people because they say that Aaron Kosminski had a phobia of bathing and he liked to eat food out of the gutter and he would have been very unsanitary. And the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper would not have let this guy anywhere near them if he had those types of traits and habits. But of course, Aaron Kosminski went into the asylum in 1891 when it was reported that he had the phobia of bathing and he ate food out of the gutter. That's not the Aaron Kosminski of 1888. We don't necessarily know that those traits and habits developed in 1888 to the best of my knowledge. So I guess I was just reconciling things and connecting the dots and just trying to imagine Jack the Ripper as this type of person who's just hiding in the shadows and attacking women without any type of previous conversations. But in doing so, I ignored a lot of hard evidence, such as Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, was seen walking with someone very shortly before her murder. Other women were also seen walking with men in their general vicinity or interacting with men prior to the murders who could have been Jack the Ripper. So there's certain key elements of the evidence that I felt she was overlooking, and I said, by my own admission, I felt my thinking was somewhat contaminated. I still think that Jacob Levy is a reasonable Jack the Ripper suspect, though. And as far as the other cases that I've looked at from her, definitely the Freeway Phantom. I did one episode about the Freeway Phantom, again talking about the psychological aspects of the case, and that is one where I thought that she made a lot of interesting points. In terms of a YouTube presentation, it was excellent. I mean, as somebody who's just watching the criminal profiler present her case, it was excellent. Did I agree with everything? No. And that's why, because you're allowed to challenge certain observations that the presenter is making, the same way that I invite you guys to challenge me. Put your ideas in the comments section down below. And what she's talking about with the Freeway Phantom is that, okay, this is what I think about the Freeway Phantom. These are some other psychological profiles. And she's telling all of these other profilers why they were wrong. And I didn't necessarily feel that all of the reasons why she rejected other people's observations on that unsolved mystery were accurate. It's like, I think you're making a good point here, and I think you're making a bad point here. And I invite everyone to listen to my episode, The Freeway Phantom Psychological Profile, here on Black Box Online Radio if you want to hear all of the specifics. And more importantly, though, I do have a certain appreciation for professionals. I recognize that I am not a professional. I'm an amateur. I am somebody who is just watching the videos and reading the books like anybody else about the cases that I follow here on Black Box Online Radio, the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper. And, I do have a certain amount of respect for Pat Brown, as well as people like John Douglas. He would be much higher in my book, definitely more influential on profiling. Richard Walters, another psychological profiler that I talk about frequently here on BBOR. But with Pat Brown, even though I respect that she's much more professional than I am, I recognize that she is much more professional than I am. When it comes to this D.B. Cooper episode that she did, I think she's wrong about everything. And even if some of her observations turn out to be accurate, I also think that it would just be done by chance, because it really appeared, as I said previously, that she's going off of intuition as opposed to looking at the facts and evaluating them. And I also have to point out that there are people like Dr. David G. Hubbard who really zone in on the fact that the majority of these skyjackers that we're going to be talking about, and the copycats, are going to have military backgrounds. And this is something that should be heavily included in these discussions, and it'd be one way to look at who D.B. Cooper was and why he committed the skyjacking. We're talking about things from the skyjacker. An underperformer who needed the money, who had an ex-military background, who comes back to civilian life. He does not succeed very well in civilian life. Now let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a second, because this was brought up on Pat Brown's show when somebody just kind of asked the question in her live chat, was D.B. Cooper married? And what she said was that it would be very odd if D.B. Cooper were married, because nobody would be missing this guy when he was gone. Nobody would know where this guy was, like nobody knew what was going on. And this is another problem that I have. I'm like, how do we know that anybody was missing D.B. Cooper? And also, how do we know if he were married? How do we know that his wife didn't know what he was doing? And the explanations that she provided for the second option were that, well, it seems like everything that D.B. Cooper is doing is based on himself. He seems like the one who is just sitting there by himself and giving out these commands, handing Florence Schaffner the note, sitting with Tina Mucklow, having Tina Mucklow light his cigarettes. Yes, he's instructing them to do things, but he's also just doing this all on his own, and there's no evidence of an accomplice. And my simple response to that is, I completely accept that, but it's not impossible, especially for something as simple as, oh yeah, he was married, but his wife knew what he was doing and just she didn't try to stop him, something to that effect. I think there's insufficient evidence to say that D.B. Cooper was never married. Married or unmarried, it could really go either way. But let's look at the second point. Nobody missed this guy? Well, how long was D.B. Cooper gone? 24 hours or something like that? And they're talking about how, this is brought up on her show. She's saying, well, maybe D.B. Cooper had no family at all or something like that, and then just nobody knew what he was doing or where he was. Doesn't that seem a little bit odd that he had absolutely no family? And I'm just thinking, now, I've lived in a city where my family didn't live before, and even with technology, even with the types of electronic communications that we have, social media, and all sorts of things, they wouldn't have known what I was doing if I just went in and took a flight and, went to another country for 24 hours and came back, hypothetically speaking. They don't know what I'm doing every single day. I've lived by myself before, and I could definitely do something in like a 24-hour, 48-hour, 72-hour time frame, and people would have no idea where I am or what I'm doing. It's possible, and it's not rocket science either. It's just that somebody didn't have anybody nearby that was waiting for them. It doesn't mean they had absolutely no family or they weren't in contact with their family. We're talking about one day, Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. So again, I really just think there's insufficient evidence for that. And that's my ultimate take. Again, no devil's advocate. What I genuinely think about D.B. Cooper is there's no evidence to say that Cooper was married or unmarried. There's no evidence to say that Cooper had an accomplice or didn't have an accomplice, because the level of an accomplice can be so great or so narrow. This could be as simple as somebody just is going to be waiting for Cooper at a certain location to be the getaway driver. This could be as simple as someone is providing an alibi in case someone does inquire about, oh, hey, where's so-and-so? Oh, yeah, he's spending the night in Portland on a business trip, something to that effect. Let's talk about business for a second, because this was also brought up on Pat Brown's show, and this is an interesting observation that I actually think is pretty good. D.B. Cooper was not a rich man. That was included in her discussions, and I mostly agree with that. She also said that D.B. Cooper was not a poor man, and I'm not convinced of that. She said that she thought that D.B. Cooper was mid-level, like a middle-class individual. He's not rich, he's not poor. The evidence for this is he seems to be rather cool, calm, and collected, wearing his business suit and all that, and he seems to give off the mannerisms of someone who was a businessman. He definitely seemed like someone who was not extremely crude or rough, but also not a rich man, because he doesn't... Well, I mean, let's just get to the heart of the issue with that. Somebody who was extremely rich wouldn't have needed the money. I completely understand that there would be this type of desire for a thrill. Yes, some rich people commit crimes for the thrill of it, but Cooper demanded $200,000. If Cooper was mega rich or something like that, that would not be an extremely beneficial thing for him to do. And I will also provide the condition, caveat, and issue, and that is that if Cooper were some type of thrill seeker, and he is a millionaire, and he's just doing this for the fun of it, that really is so much lower in terms of probability of actually happening, as opposed to Cooper being a middle-class or working-class individual who did this because he wanted the money. It's not impossible, but I would propose that a rich D.B. Cooper is improbable. So that I do agree with Pat Brown on, and I think that that's a solid observation on her part. But if we're going to talk about getting to the heart of the issue, I want to come back to one point, and that relates to D.B. Cooper's heritage. Everybody is just making a mountain out of a molehill when it comes to D.B. Cooper's skin complexion. And there's one thing I meant to say earlier. They're just so baffled about how D.B. Cooper could have been a white Caucasian male with olive skin. What on earth does that mean? And Pat Brown openly conceded in her live stream, in the later parts, that, all right, maybe he wasn't an American Indian or a First Nation. Maybe he was somebody who had a Norwegian father and a Mexican mother. And I'm like, yes, now we're getting somewhere. There are lots of people around the world who have darker complexions or olive skin complexions. Let's look at this, though, even beyond having Latin American heritage. There are people from Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, who have olive skin, like Spain and Italy, and even if they aren't from Spain or Italy themselves, their parents could have been of Spanish descent or Italian descent. Also, people from Eastern Europe can have olive skin complexions, particularly in the Black Sea region. So this whole thing about how D.B. Cooper had olive skin, that doesn't necessarily indicate that he was a Latino. It doesn't necessarily indicate that he was a Native American. It's just, again, it just means that when you're looking for a suspect, it's something to consider that he had a type of olive skin complexion. And a lot of these suspects out there who were extremely pale, it's something to consider. You can just look at this from the facts. Oh yeah, this guy's extremely pale, he's Snow White. D.B. Cooper had olive skin, so that's something to consider. Now, another point that was brought up in the live stream that was really interesting was in relation to the concept of a midlife crisis. What Pat Brown said was that she thought that D.B. Cooper was doing this because of a midlife crisis, saying that you can see this with mass shooters as a parallel example. Mass shooters commit their crimes when they're in their teen years or in their 40s, because in their teen years they just think that life's not going to get any better, I'm going to end things. And someone in their 40s is thinking, life's not going to get any better, I'm going to end things. And firstly, it's not only the teen years, also the early 20s. I'm sure she was thinking it. I really do mean that, to give her credit. I'm sure she was thinking about early 20s and teen years together. But think of some of the most famous mass shooters out there, such as perhaps Elliot Rodger or Cho Sung, the Virginia Tech shooter, and James Holmes, they were in their 20s. And it's not impossible for a mass shooter to operate in their 30s. Just 2 days ago, I caught this very long YouTube presentation on Nassim Agdam. She was the woman, a female mass shooter who shot up the YouTube headquarters several years ago. And she was in her 30s, so it's not impossible for a shooter to be in their 30s. But what she's talking about with someone in their 40s is that it's not done for a type of, oh, my life will never work out. It's done in a way such as, my life has not worked out and it's not going to get any better. Therefore, I'm going to do something very destructive because I'm mad at society, I'm mad at the world, and I'm mad at everyone. So that's why somebody would commit a mass shooting. And she's using that as a parallel example to skyjacking. Someone is thinking that, okay, my life didn't work out. I'm going to get revenge on society. But a key difference is this person isn't trying to just kill people and kill themselves. This person is trying to obtain money and get away without causing any destruction. To the best of my knowledge, people always challenge me on this. How do you know that D.B. Cooper never killed anyone? I don't, but I do know that he didn't kill anyone on the plane, to the best of my knowledge. But D.B. Cooper is doing this to obtain the money, perhaps get some type of thrill, and also this could be an ego boost. I get all of those things. If you're dealing with a suspect who is in his 40s, early 40s and mid 40s, the way that she proposed. So I think that I can understand the midlife crisis aspect of it. I don't agree with all of her observations about mass shooters, but if D.B. Cooper were in his 40s or even 50s like Milton Vordal, it could be done as a type of response to just being unsatisfied with life. And we have to remember that D.B. Cooper openly stated on the plane that he had a grudge. He didn't have a grudge against the airline. He had a grudge, period. And this statement was discussed by Pat Brown when she said that she thought that he meant Boeing. And, this might be one of her stronger points. If it turns out that D.B. Cooper actually did work for Boeing, this might be something that she didn't get just by chance. And that is that when he says he has a grudge, she thought that he meant the company Boeing because he had worked with Boeing. He had an intimate knowledge of airplanes that he could have learned at Boeing. And he wanted to be clear that he wasn't upset with Northwest Orient Airlines. He had worked for Boeing and he had a falling out with Boeing, and that he was doing this as a way to get revenge on the company, make a mockery of the company. Okay, if it turns out that those things are accurate, maybe she got something right. A lot of her other observations, like, I don't necessarily know if they would be, you could even say that it was profiling. It was mostly just like the first thing that came to mind, almost the way that some people do palm reading or tarot cards, so to speak. And I don't mean that lightly. I think some of her observations were really just the pure equivalent to the light bulb moment that I have sometimes when I'm watching a true crime case. Oh, I have an idea about something. Well, it doesn't mean that that's what actually happened. That's just one possibility that came to mind, and I think there was a lot of that in her episode. But overall, what do you think about the profile of D.B. Cooper that has been created? Again, let's go through her observations. D.B. Cooper was around 40 years old. He was a Caucasian male, possibly with Canadian First Nation origins. She called it Native Canadian on her show. He planned to hijack the plane going from Portland to Seattle. He displayed knowledge of Seattle and Tacoma, and then he jumps out over southern Washington because he wants to get across the Canadian border back to Canada, exchanges the money for Canadian currency, and then he just spends it normally. She believes that the money maybe fell out of the plane over Tina Bar, and that's how it got there. No human hands involved. Natural means it fell there. This is somebody who could have had a reasonable understanding of the French language coming from Canada, and that he was familiar with the Dan Cooper comics, and that he did this as a type of midlife crisis crime, so to speak. He did want the money, but it's also done to try and reshape his life in a certain way. What do you think about all of those observations? I've spent the last 45 minutes telling you what I think, so I'd love to know what you would say in response to Pat Brown's profile. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and there's also Black Box Online Radio, a specific page on Facebook, and I use Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok to upload shorts and reels Monday through Friday. My TikTok and Instagram names are blackboxonlineradio. The reels that I put out are mostly about general true crime stories. I did a big Jack the Ripper series, but now they're mostly focused on just anything in the true crime world under the sun or in the darkness. And that will be all for me now. I'll see you on Monday to talk about the Zodiac Killer. Until next time.